Welcome back to this video lecture series for ethics. In this video, we will continue our discussion of Mill's utilitarianism. And you'll recall that in our previous video, we gave a general definition of what utilitarianism is. We said that utilitarianism is just the moral theory that the correct action from a moral point of view is the one that produces the greatest happiness for the greatest number. And in this video, we're going to look at utilitarianism in a more detailed and specific way. We're going to break it down into its three major components and discuss those components in detail. In this particular video, we're going to introduce two of those components, consequentialism and hedonism, and we're going to focus on hedonism in particular to give you an idea of specifically what John Stuart Mill thinks it is that makes a human life go well. Okay, so to back up, I want to begin with the following statement, and we actually went through this paragraph already at some length in our previous video where we talked about theories of right action, but I want to point out another sentence of the paragraph which we haven't said much about. So Mill tells us that all action is for the sake of some end, and rules of action, it seems natural to suppose, must take their whole character and color from the end to which they are subservient. So what is Mill telling us here? So he's telling us if we want to know whether some moral rule is a good rule, if we want to know whether some action is a good action, then the first question to ask is, the first thing to think about is, where do I look? What aspect of actions is it that makes them right or wrong? What aspect is it of a moral rule, like don't lie, don't murder people, don't steal, right? Don't defraud people, right? What aspect of that rule is it that tells me it's a good rule? And what Mill is telling us here is that whenever we're thinking about a good or a right or a virtuous action, or a bad or vicious or wrong action, when we make those determinations, we're always looking at the end of the consequence of the action. He says, in a sense, it's sort of very similar to Aristotle we saw previously. Every single action we take is for some end, it's for some purpose. And so Mill thinks it's totally natural to think that when we're thinking about, well, is it good in this instance to tell a lie? Is it good in this instance to donate to charity, to help this person out, to murder this individual, right? Whenever we're thinking about, is that action a good action or a bad action, the question that should be at the forefront of our minds is, what is the consequence? Because the consequence or the end is what explains the purpose of the action in the first place. And this is the first fundamental aspect of utilitarianism that you need to understand that's going to mark it off from other moral theories, specifically one we'll cover later in this course. And as philosophers, we give a specific name to this aspect of utilitarianism. It's called consequentialism. So you'll recall the theory as a whole says the ethically correct action produces the greatest happiness for the greatest number. But what aspect of actions determines their goodness or badness? The answer that utilitarians give is called consequentialism. And this is the first aspect of the theory. And what consequentialism holds is that the only aspect of the action that matters for determining the moral value of an action is the consequence produced by it. So imagine you're thinking about, okay, should I tell a lie to this person in this circumstance? Now, when you're thinking about that question, you might say, well, what is it about this lie that I need to be concerned about? Is it the intent of the lie? Is it the motivation of the lie? Is it what I feel in my heart when I'm saying the lie? Or is it the consequence, the result, what is produced by the lie? Does the lie produce sadness? Does it produce suffering? Does it produce envy and jealousy? Does the lie produce happiness and pleasure and joy and reconciliation and cooperation? Right, so what Mill is telling you here is that whenever you think about any action you're going to perform, what really matters is the latter. It's not so important what your intent is, and it's not so important what is in your heart or what you feel or what motivated you to do the action. What matters is what is the result. And I'm not going to say a ton about this aspect of utilitarianism at this time, although it's extremely important. But in a couple weeks, we will be looking at some applied ethical issues which really touch on this question. Are the consequences of our actions all that matter, Or are there other aspects of actions that matter as well? But okay, so for the moment, let's just take this as being the case. We'll come back to examining consequentialism in more detail later. But let's just say, okay, let's accept Mill's claim that what makes some action good or bad is its consequence. Well, the next natural question you would ask is, okay, well, how do we know whether some consequence is good or bad? And because if you think about it in this way, you say, okay, I'm thinking about telling a lie and I'm, thinking about what are the consequences. Well, I can only know if those consequences are good or bad if I know whether, for instance, pain and suffering are bad or pleasure and joy are good, or if envy is bad or reconciliation and cooperation are good. I can only judge the consequences of an action if I actually know what matters in people's lives. To judge the consequences of my action, I have to know what is it that makes people's lives go well, and what is it that makes people's lives go poorly. And this means that when we think about whether the consequences of our actions are good or bad, we are asking what philosophers call the well-being question. And one philosopher, Ben Bramble, he puts it in the following way. The well-being question just is, what determines the various respects in which someone's life, considered as a whole, went well or poorly for her? Now, this, of course, is not a foreign question to us. We spent the majority of the first half of this class discussing Aristotle, and he was intimately and very deeply concerned with this question of how do we judge a whole human life. And because Mill is a consequentialist, because he thinks that what makes our actions go right or go wrong, what makes them morally good or morally bad, is the consequences they produce, he also needs a theory of well-being. Because unless we know what makes someone's life go well, we can't know whether the consequence of our action is good or bad. So, and this will be the primary focus of this video. According to John Stuart Mill, what is it that makes a human life go well, what makes a human life go poorly, and how do we use that to judge the consequences of our actions? So if utilitarianism doesn't just presume that the foundation of human happiness and well-being is just bare practical necessity, then what is the foundation of human well-being? Well, Mill tells us in what he terms the greatest happiness principle that once again, just like Aristotle, he says it is in fact happiness. He tells us the creed which accepts as the foundation of morals utility, or the greatest happiness principle, holds that actions are right in proportion as they tend to promote happiness, wrong as they tend to produce the reverse of happiness. And on this point, this idea that the point of morality itself is to produce as much happiness as possible, Mill was influenced by another very famous utilitarian philosopher named Jeremy Bentham. Jeremy Bentham was actually a family friend of the Mills, right? So Mill and his father were both utilitarian philosophers, and so was their family friend Jeremy Bentham. Maybe you could say a bit of a family business. And so he picked up many of Bentham's ideas and extended them and somewhat changed them in certain respects. But you also see this in Bentham. He says, by the principle of utility is meant that principle which approves or disapproves of every action whatsoever, according to the tendency which it appears to have to augment or diminish the happiness of those who are interested in the question. So the basic point here is that for Mill, the foundation of morality is happiness. But of course we saw that for Aristotle, the foundation of morality was happiness. In fact, in a certain way, for Aquinas, the foundation of morality was happiness, although defined as beatitude in a union with God. So the point is that we have three very different philosophers, Aristotle, Aquinas, and Mill, all telling us that happiness is sort of the foundation of well-being, the foundation of ethics and morality, but the devil is in the details. The question is, how is Mill defining happiness? How is it different from what we see in Aristotle, what we saw with Aquinas? So here is the way that Mill defines happiness. When you ask him what is happiness, he says, happiness is intended pleasure and the absence of pain, unhappiness, pain, and the privation of pleasure. So to live a human life just is to live a life with as much pleasure and as little pain as possible. On the other side, an unhappy life is a life with as much pain and as little pleasure as possible. Now, the first thing that you should notice here is that Unlike Aristotle, unlike Aquinas, who spent a great deal of time and effort explaining to us why, in fact, the foundation of happiness for a human being cannot be mere pleasure. Neither of them rejected completely the importance of pleasure, but both of them said it can't be the foundation of human happiness. Aristotle told us that a life of pleasure is like a life of cattle. It's not a life fit for a human being. Aquinas told us that, yes, beatitude in union with God is pleasurable, but that's just like a side effect of beatitude. Pleasure isn't what actually constitutes beatitude. So we see a very different idea, however, from Mill. Mill is going to tell us that no, our happiness is a matter of pleasure and pain, having as much pleasure as possible and having as little pain as possible. And what does that tell you about Mill's view? Well, to some extent, it's more naturalistic. Mill accepts or he emphasizes the idea that we are biological creatures. We are animals, just like other animals. And although, as we're going to see, our pleasures and pains are of a different type, that there are certain pleasures that we are capable of that no other animal could be capable of. Despite that fact, the good of human beings and the good of other animals bottoms out in the same fundamental thing. Insofar as we are biological organisms, insofar as we are organisms that can experience pleasure and pain, insofar as no one would disagree that pain is a bad thing and pleasure is a good thing, to live a good life, or to answer the question of well-being, we simply need to point to the fact that happiness consists of pleasure in the absence of pain, and unhappiness just the opposite. So whereas Aristotle and Aquinas really want to emphasize our differentiation from the rest of the animal world, Mill and the Utilitarians generally are going to want to emphasize our continuity with it. And this is also going to be very important for some practical ethical issues we're going to get to, specifically the treatment of non-human animals. Because if what is good for us is similar and continuous with what is good for other beings, for other animals, then that should have some real ramifications in how we treat them. But that's a point for a different video in the future, so we'll put that aside for the moment. Now, Mill makes another very important point as he's describing his view of happiness. He tells us the theory of life on which this theory of morality is grounded, namely that pleasure and freedom of pain are the only things desirable as ends, and that all desirable things, which are as numerous in the utilitarian scheme as in any other, are desirable either for the pleasure inherent in themselves, or as means to the promotion of pleasure and the prevention of pain. Okay, so it's a lot of fancy words there, but what is he saying here? He's saying there is a distinction between the things we value in this system. Because at first you might say, well, the only thing that's valuable is pleasure, the only thing that's bad is pain, but that's not quite right. As Mill says here, utilitarians would grant that many things are good, many things are bad. But the point he's making is that there's a certain sort of goodness or badness, a certain kind of value that only pleasure and pain have. He tells us that pleasure and pain are the only things desired as ends, or the only things we want to avoid as ends, you might say. Everything else that is good is desired only as a means to promoting pleasure, or a means of allowing us to avoid pain. And it's probably best to look at an example here. So suppose we consider the idea of a doctor's visit. Someone's asks you, well, is a doctor's visit good? Is it a good thing to do? And you'd probably be like, yeah, I mean, it's good to do. I don't necessarily enjoy it. You always get there early, but you always have to end up seeing the doctor late. And the magazines in the waiting room aren't all that wonderful. But you might say there's a sense in which it's good. But it's not inherently good. You may not enjoy going to the doctor. And you say, why are you at the doctor? Well, because I want to cure this illness I have. And sometimes we just stop there. We say, okay, that's the purpose of a doctor's visit. But notice you can continue asking this question. Why do you want to cure that illness? Well, you say, because I want to be healthy. And even there, we're often tempted to stop. We might just say, well, health is a good thing. But ask the further question. Why is it that you want to be healthy? Because you could be unhealthy. You could be sick. Why do you want to be healthy in the first place? And what Mill is going to say is that the reason you want to be healthy is because the state of being healthy is one in which there's the presence of pleasure, it feels good to be healthy, and maybe more importantly in this context, there's an absence of pain. When you're sick, when you are not well, you're feeling pain, and when you're healthy, you're feeling pleasure. And so his point is that if you take any action you perform, and you conduct this sort of line of questioning, at some point you will always get to the answer that the reason I'm doing this is because I believe it will bring me pleasure and it will bring me the absence of pain. And so this distinction from above, where he says some things are desired as means and other things are desired as ends, this is what he's talking about. The doctor's visit, curing an illness, health, these are all desired as means to an end. They're things you are using to get to the end. But there's only one thing that has intrinsic good. There's only one thing that is valuable in and of itself, that's desired as an end, and that is the presence of pleasure and the absence of pain. So it's important to notice that Mill is not telling us that pleasure is the only thing that's good. Doctor's visits are good, bikes are good, tables are good, going to school is good, all these things are good. He's just saying that the only thing that's good in itself is the presence of pleasure and absence of pain. Again, what Aristotle put there was eudaimonia, which he saw something broader and more inclusive than pleasure. What Aquinas put there was beatitude, union with God. And now we see yet another example from Mill. He just embraces our animal nature and says that fundamentally what makes our lives go well, what's desired as an end, desired in itself, is the presence of pleasure and the absence of pain. Now at this point, because we've already seen that there are other answers to this question, we might ask the question, why should we believe this answer? Right, we've seen other answers to this question. Other philosophers believe that there are different things that are desired as ends. Why should we believe Mill when he says that, no, what's desired as an end is the presence of pleasure and absence of pain? Well, he makes an interesting point here. He says, what we're talking about is an ultimate end, right? The end that makes sense of all of our actions. And what he tells us about these ultimate ends, things with intrinsic value that are valued in and of themselves, is that questions of ultimate ends are not amenable to direct proof. Now, what does that mean? He says, you can't directly prove why pleasure is good and pain is bad. Well, what would it mean to directly prove something? He goes on to explain, whatever can be proved to be good must be so by being shown to be a means to something admitted to be good without proof. The medical art is proved to be good by its conducing to health. But how is it possible to prove health is good? The art of music is good for the reason, among others, that it produces pleasure. But what proof is it possible to give that pleasure is good? So, what he means by direct proof is the ability to say, well, here's a good thing, and here's the reason why it's good, because this is the consequence or the end that it achieves. So I can directly prove that the doctor's visit is good because it cures illness. I can prove that curing illness is good because it promotes health. But now ask the question about the presence of pleasure and the absence of pain. If someone asked you, why do you want to experience pleasure? If someone asked you, why is it a bad thing to have to undergo pain and suffering? Well, you wouldn't be able to point to some further end. You wouldn't say, well, I want to experience pleasure because of X. There'd be nothing you could fill in the blank with. And so this is his point. He says, really, there's no way I can directly prove to you that pleasure is in fact a good thing. I can't directly prove to you that the absence of pain is a good thing. So what reason do we have to think that those are the only things desired as ends? So on this point, the first thing that Mill tells us we need to notice is that when we're asking the question of what is desirable in itself, what is intrinsic value, what is valued as an end, we are asking a question about what things are desirable. He tells us questions about ends are, in other words, questions about what things are desirable. And he draws a comparison here to other sorts of analogous experiences. So he says, consider the following example. The only proof capable of being given that an object is visible is that people actually see it. So let's say someone asks you, well, how do you know a table is a visible object? Well, you say, I can see a table. I experience it directly with my sense of sight. He also says the only proof that a sound is audible is that people hear it, and so of the other sources of our experience. So if someone asks you the question, why is sound an audible thing? You look at them very strangely and just say, well, what more proof do you need? I can hear it. I can see the table, so it's a visible object. I can hear the sound of music playing, so it's an audible thing. I can touch my laptop right now, and so that proves that it's something that has an effect on my sense of touch. It's a tangible thing. So in all these cases, when we're dealing with something that we experience and we want to prove that in fact we're experiencing, we just appeal to the experience itself. Now turn to ethics and we're asking the question, what is desirable? And in the same way, Mill is going to tell us the following. In like manner, I apprehend, the sole evidence it is possible to produce that anything is desirable is that people do actually desire it. No reason can be given why the general happiness is desire, except that each person, so far as he believes it to be attainable, desires his own happiness. So what is happiness? Happiness is the presence of pleasure and the absence of pain. How do we know that's a good thing? Everybody wants it. You're not going to be able to ask anyone who's going to say, you know what, I'm not really into pleasure. Now, for sure, people will won't pursue every pleasure. They'll be prudent. There's some pleasures you may not enjoy, or things you might not think are pleasurable that other people do. But in some form or fashion, everyone wants pleasure and nobody wants to suffer. And so just the way that we prove that something is a visible thing by seeing it, we prove something is an audible thing by hearing it, we prove that something has intrinsic value, that it's valued as an end because people desire it as an end. Mill is assuming here that the reason behind our actions, the reason which pushes us to do the great variety and diversity of many things that we actually do in our lives, is because we are pursuing pleasure. And if we are desiring pleasure as an end, then that's all the proof we need to show that it actually has intrinsic value. The fact that we share our ability to feel pleasure with other animals, that it isn't solely something experienced by the human species, isn't too much of a problem for Mill, although he will have more things to say about that. The main thing just is that as these animal biological organisms with the ability for consciousness and the ability to feel pleasure, that is what we desire as an end. And so that's all the evidence we need to say that in fact pleasure has intrinsic value. Now, there's one point you might make here. You might say, well, wait a minute, aren't there other things that people desire as ends? So let's return to our friend Scrooge McDuck. You'll recall I brought up this example when we talked about Aristotle. Aristotle told us that Scrooge McDuck had it all wrong, right? He was living for the sake of money when money is clearly a means to an end and not an end in itself. But isn't this example a problem for Mill? I mean, Mill is telling us that if someone desires something as an end, then that is evidence that that thing is desirable as an end. It's evidence that that thing has intrinsic value. So shouldn't we say in Scrooge McDuck's case that in fact, well, here's someone who desires money as an end, therefore money must have intrinsic value. And if money has intrinsic value, isn't there something besides pleasure with intrinsic value? And then can't we say there are a whole bunch of other things that seem to have intrinsic value? Don't people desire truth as an end in itself? What about beauty? What about virtue? What about friendship? Can't we say that all these things have their own sort of intrinsic value as well? So Mill needs a response here. Specifically, he needs a response that explains why it is that pleasure is the only thing with intrinsic value. He needs an explanation of what's going on in these cases. And he actually provides an explanation specifically on this point. So Mill asks the question, what, for example, should we say of the love of money? What should we say about the Scrooge McDuck, the miser who just hoards up money and seems to pursue it for its own sake? There's nothing originally more desirable, Mill tells us, about money than about any heap of glittering pebbles. Its worth is solely that which it will buy. Yet the love of money is not only one of the strongest moving forces of human life. But money is in many cases desired in it for itself. The desire to possess it is often stronger than the desire to use it. And you might see this in your own life, where sometimes you're just pleased by the fact that you have more money in your bank account, even if you're not thinking about what you'll use it for in that moment. So what do we say in those cases? What do we say when it seems like we're desiring something besides pleasure as an end? Well, here's what Mill responds. It may then be said truly that money is desired not for the sake of an end, but as part of the end. From being a means to happiness, it has become to be itself a principal ingredient of the individual's conception of happiness. So when you have someone like Scrooge McDuck, or the miser who just hoards money and wealth and seems to pursue money as an end, does that mean there's something besides pleasure that has intrinsic value that's desired as an end? Well, Mill would say not really. All it means is that for this individual, they simply cannot feel pleasure. They cannot have a pleasurable, happy life without money. The possession and hoarding up of money has become so important to them, becomes such an integral part of their psychology and what they see as their own happiness, that they simply cannot live without it. And to be clear, I don't think Mill is saying that this is necessarily a good thing for that individual. I think that he has good reasons to think that we ought to have other things as principal ingredients of our happiness. His point just is that this doesn't show that pleasure isn't the only thing with intrinsic value. It's just that for this person, hoarding money is absolutely necessary ingredient of them being experiencing pleasure and being happy. On a happier note, the same thing can happen with other things that are, you might say, more valuable than just hoarding up money, like virtue. So Mill tells us those who desire virtue for its own sake desire it either because the consciousness of it is a pleasure, or because the consciousness of being without it is a pain, or for both reasons united. So when we see someone who says virtue is of fundamental importance, like Aristotle, and they pursue virtue and want to live a virtuous life, well, how do we explain this? For Mill, just like as the Scrooge McDuck or the miser, for that person, hoarding up money has its own intrinsic value. For someone like Aristotle, or the very virtuous person, for that person, virtue has become a principal ingredient of their happiness for which they cannot be happy without it. And so at the end of the day, what Mill is going to say is that all things are ultimately valued because they bring us pleasure. And perhaps this might suggest a trick to leading a virtuous, good human life is similar to what Aristotle said. It's becoming the sort of person, training yourself to be the sort of person, developing into the sort of person for whom the principal ingredient in your happiness is virtue. It's being kind, it's being just, it's being courageous. That is the sort of moral exemplar that I think, for all their differences, both Aristotle and Mill would recognize as an end that we ought to try to achieve. Now, to sum up all these points, what I've explained in this video is a second aspect of utilitarianism. So we saw the first aspect, which is consequentialism. All actions are valued ultimately for their consequences. Then we said what makes a consequence go well. We're asking the well-being question, right? We're asking the question, what is it that makes a human being's life go well? And this leads to the second aspect of utilitarianism, which is called hedonism. So hedonism holds that the only intrinsic good is pleasure, and all other things that are valuable as instrumental goods that produce pleasure. Again, the way Mill puts it, happiness is desirable, and the only thing desirable as an end, all other things being only desirable as means to that end. So we've seen so far the moral picture he gives us is do actions that produce good consequences. Good consequences are measured in terms of pleasure and the absence of pain, and they're measured in that way because pleasure and the absence of pain is what makes a human life go well. It's what constitutes our happiness. Now, in the next video, we will have much more to say about this sort of hedonistic view of life and whether it really captures what it means to be a human being and it captures the well-being of human being. But for now, I will cut this video. Thanks as always for listening, and I will see you next time.